Good afternoon, students, faculty, distinguished guests, friends. Welcome to the School of International Service. My name is Christine Chin. I'm the Dean of SIS. And today I have the pleasure of welcoming the European Union's Ambassador to the United States, His Excellency David O'Sullivan. I'm glad he can join us today to speak with Professor Garret Martin and to take your questions. This is a, quote, interesting time for those of us who believe in multilateralism, peace and security, and a rules-based international order. This is also an interesting time for those of us who believe in the free movement of people across borders, as well as the benefits of free trade agreements. These are some of the core values that the European Union has tried to exemplify and promote over time. The EU in its current and earlier forms emerged from the ashes of war to heal the wounds of nationalism on the continent, to break down trade barriers, and to institutionalize a respect for human rights and the rule of law. Its successes have been many, but many of those successes have been taken for granted. And the challenges the EU faces at this time, both from within and without, are great. Greater perhaps than at any time since the end of the Cold War. Our guest knows all about this. A long-time and distinguished EU official, Ambassador O'Sullivan has served in a number of senior posts in the European Public Service, including Secretary General of the European Commission and Director General for Trade. Since 2014, he has overseen the EU's bilateral relationship with the US, including political, economic, and commercial affairs. His diplomatic posting will come to an end at the end of this month, so we're particularly fortunate to get a chance to hear from him at the end of his tenure, when he has so much experience and accumulated wisdom upon which to draw. Ambassador O'Sullivan will be joined on stage by SIS's own Professor Garret Martin. Garret has published widely on transatlantic relations, both in the field of history and contemporary affairs. He focuses on US foreign policy, NATO, European foreign policy and defense, and the European Union. Ambassador David O'Sullivan, we look forward to hearing the discussion between you and Professor Martin, and eagerly await the questions that our students have for you. Welcome to the School of International Service.
The agreement in 1999 was facilitated by many things: the courage of people in Northern Ireland who decided to end the conflict, the very constructive role of the British and Irish governments, and a very positive support from the United States. Senator Mitchell and Bill Clinton in particular really gave a lot of support. But, and this is often forgotten, probably the single greatest catalyst was joint membership of the European Union, because that enabled the squaring of a very difficult circle in Northern Ireland, which was to give a constitutional guarantee to the people of Northern Ireland that there would be no change in the constitutional position of Northern Ireland as a part of the United Kingdom without the consent of the majority in Northern Ireland. And this was, from a nationalist perspective, seen as a big concession. And for the nationalists, in return for that, nonetheless, the recognition that actually, on a day-to-day basis, on the island of Ireland, with both the UK and Ireland in the European Union, there was no border. There was really no difference between living on one side of the border or the other, because you could live in one part, work in the other, you could move freely, you had the same rights and entitlements as citizens, and so forth. Brexit puts that into question. And I want to be very clear, from the very beginning, the British government itself and the British Parliament have said clearly they do not want to return to a hard border. So there's no disagreement. The issue is, does Brexit trigger a high risk of a hard border returning? And I'm afraid when you take Brexit to mean that the UK wishes to leave the single market and wishes to leave the customs union, I'm afraid the net result is you think, well, there's going to have to be a hard border. How do you manage two different customs jurisdictions? How do you manage two different regulatory jurisdictions without checking things at the border? Remember, the motto of the Leave campaign was take back control of the border. So this was a kind of circle that had to be squared. The solution that was found was to have was to hope that when we negotiate a future trade relationship with the UK after they leave, and we can only do that after they leave because you can't negotiate an agreement with a third country while they're still a member, so you have to finish the withdrawal process and then start negotiating a new arrangement. We all hope that whatever the new arrangement is, a free trade agreement, whatever, it will be possible to have measures that make it unnecessary to have a hard border. To be frank, nobody knows exactly what that would look like at this point. Because for the reasons I said, once you have two different jurisdictions, in principle, you need some kind of border. Therefore, there was this idea of a backstop, which is a term borrowed from cricket. I won't explain it to you from that point of view. But basically, it's easier, perhaps you say it's an insurance policy. It's a kind of fail-safe. If it's not possible to solve this problem of the border through the trade negotiations, you have a guarantee that whatever happens, there will be no border. And that was basically involving certain commitments that the UK would remain part of the customs union and Northern Ireland would keep regulatory alignment with the EU as a means of obviating the need for a border. This is what has proven to be quite a stumbling block at the British Parliament. The British government, if I understand correctly, would like to renegotiate this backstop on the basis that either it is time limited or the UK can unilaterally withdraw from it. The problem with that is it's like an insurance policy which sort of says, well, your house is insured against fire except when we decide it isn't. And that doesn't work, frankly. And no one has quite figured out how you solve this problem. And so that's where we are. I think there are going to be some difficult discussions, but I remain convinced that we will find a solution because I don't think anyone wants a disorderly departure of the UK. Many of us would wish that they wouldn't leave at all, but they've made their democratic choice, and we respect that. So I'm relatively confident that one way or another we will find a solution, but I have to say it is not. I can't today give you the answer that solves the conundrum with which we are faced. Sorry, that was a very long answer, but it's...
It's a very complicated process, that's for sure. Is there a silver lining, though, when you observe how difficult the negotiations have been for the UK and the realization that for every choice there are consequences, that you cannot have your cake and eat it too when it comes to membership in the European Union or membership in the Customs Union? Is there a silver lining there in terms of the message it sends to the remaining members, as well as to citizens, in terms of not taking for granted the benefits as well as the responsibilities of being members of the European Union?
Yeah, I don't know if it's a silver lining. I think it is true that the Brexit discussion is a kind of petri dish experiment of de-globalization. It's the first really concrete place where a country basically says, I'm going backwards in terms of globalization. And I think that the two conclusions are exactly what you say. One, it's a hell of a lot more complicated than the people who advocated and gave the impression, because people did give the impression that this would be simple. You just vote to leave, and then we leave, and everything's fine. Nothing basically changes. And that then leads to the second conclusion, which is, indeed, there are choices and there are consequences, and you can choose to leave, you can choose to deglobalize, you can choose to sort of put barriers back up with your trading partners, but it does have very direct consequences. I think there probably has been a little bit of a sort of salutary reminder to the rest of us, the benefits of membership and the complexity and the sort of things that people don't think about or even acknowledge on a daily basis. I take no satisfaction from that, though I would much rather that we didn't have to go through this process for the rest of us to understand the benefits of what we built together.
So, we are now about the 20 years after the introduction of the euro as a real currency, and now about 10 years removed, more or less, from the financial crisis. How would you define now the state of the Eurozone? There have certainly been some changes since the acute phase of the crisis in 2010 to 2012. There have been some progress made over the banking unions and having more solid foundations, but there are still deep divides within the Eurozone as to the makeup of the Eurozone, whether there should be a specific budget. So how would you assess the current state of the Eurozone and its aptitude to deal with any future crisis like the one experienced 10 years ago?
I think the Eurozone is like the rest of the European project. There is not necessarily a sort of predefined end point which has to be reached or which people want to reach. It is an iterative process of building a common currency and figuring out as you go along and as you have experiences, what are the tweaks and changes that you need to make that work better, or how far do you want to go in other forms of integration linked to having a single currency. I think, and by the way, we are on the 20th anniversary, and if you look again, support for the euro is at its highest since I think it was even introduced. And it may not be, I've said this many times here in Washington, I've had some sort of economists challenge me, but I still stand by it. The euro has been a success. And, you are all too young. I know why we built the euro because I lived through the 1970s when we had the two oil shocks and we had European currencies going off like fireworks in all directions and competitive devaluations and confusion and it was, and I still believe that the crisis of 2008, which I gently remind you was a virus imported from the United States, not made in Europe, it triggered a crisis, which was not a crisis of the currency. Actually, it was a sovereign debt crisis, and we can talk more about that if you wish. But in fact, I think if we had 16 individual currencies, as it would have been at that time, the crisis would have been far deeper and far worse. So I think most Europeans still believe that having a single currency between us is by far the best option versus having independent currencies. Because what is the main benefit in the modern era of having your own currency? It is the ability to devalue. Now, two things about devaluing. When you devalue, yes, may make your exports cheaper, but it makes imports more expensive. And in the modern economy, imports are mainly your inputs to your exports. So actually, you may not get an economic boost from devaluation at all, because by the time you're finished paying higher prices for your imports, your exports actually end up not much cheaper. The other point, which is the really important one, is if everybody has the right to devalue, it becomes pointless. If everyone around you, if you devalue your currency and everyone else devalues theirs, you've gained nothing. And that's what we had in the 70s. And that's why we decided in Europe, since the bulk of our trade in the Eurozone and in Europe generally is between ourselves. We're an important trading bloc, but like all countries, the percentage of GDP which is actually traded is relatively small. It makes much more sense to have to eliminate the exchange risk and have the certainty and the facility of a single currency. Here in the United States, I very much doubt that West Virginia and California would have the same currency in an ideal economic world. But West Virginia, you could give West Virginia the right to have its own currency and devalue it, but it would lose far more than it gains from being part of a single dollar zone, and the same is true in Europe. Having said that, the crisis revealed a number of deficiencies, notably in the extent to which countries maintained a common policy which took sufficient account of the fact that we had a common currency. Member states for many years still behaved as though, we have a common currency, but I can still have an economic policy, particularly in terms of public finances, which is widely different from that of my neighbors. And of course, that doesn't work. And that was a hard lesson, and we've learned it, and we've taken measures to make sure that will not happen again. We've put in place banking union. None of this, all of this is still work in progress. There are people who would like to see us go further in terms of the economic and financial integration, and there are people who are hesitant because they don't want the Eurozone to become what's called a transfer union, in other words, where certain countries are basically funding the poor economic management of others. And that's the debate. And I think, frankly, that's a debate that will continue for many years. We will certainly, in my view, make progress in the next year or so on further improvements. But I think, can the euro resist a further crisis? Well, difficult to predict because you don't necessarily, the next crisis will not be the same as the last crisis. But I continue to believe that I don't think we will get ourselves ever back into the kind of existential public finances crisis that we had in the last 10 years. And I still think that the euro is the best choice for our member states and will continue to be.
So democratic backsliding and the erosion of the rule of law are not specific problems that are only happening in Europe, but they have manifested themselves in recent years in Europe, most noticeably in Poland and Hungary. Prior to accession to the European Union, there was a belief or a sense that the accession process would ensure democratization, but that's not necessarily fully proved to be entirely the case now. And I know there's been talk as part of the negotiations for the next multi-annual budget of the European Union to start tying rule of law and aid together. So my questions are, first of all, where do you think this erosion of the rule of law and democratic backsliding is stemming from? And do you think that adding more teeth and tying aid to rule of law requirements can make a difference to tackle that problem?
Well, I think you're right that, I think one of the great achievements of the European Union in the last 20 years was the big enlargement of 2008 when we brought in the 10 countries of Central Europe and added 2 years later Bulgaria and Romania, and in 2013 Croatia. I often say, I think I may have said it here, that the European Union cannot claim credit for the fall of the Berlin Wall or the collapse of the Soviet Empire, but it can claim credit for the fact that that collapse was not followed by chaos and conflict and violence, but rather by a very orderly progression from totalitarian communism to Western liberal democracies based on the rule of law, human rights, respect for individual liberties, and the social market economy. And this was a remarkable achievement of these countries to do that in some 14 years between 1990 and 2004. There were concerns at the time that issues might arise that we hadn't had before, and that's why Article 7 was put into the treaty to basically say that if a country is no longer respecting the fundamental rights and rule of law principles on which the European Union is based, which is part of the Charter on Fundamental Rights, which is attached to the treaty, there were sanctions which could be adopted. They could lose the right to vote. They could lose the right to financial transfers. And I don't think any of us really thought we would ever need to use this. It never really occurred to us that people who had embraced democracy might feel tempted somehow to kind of reverse that. I think we are now facing some challenges in that regard. I think the situation is very varied and very different, and I think we have to be very careful not to overgeneralize as though all these countries are the same. Poland and Hungary, they're very different situations, very different situations. And I think we also have to be very careful not to fall into a kind of East-West divide. I think there's definitely a sense on the part of some of the Central and Eastern European countries that somehow there are, double standards, that the same criteria are not being applied. So I think it's a very difficult or complex situation to manage. On the other hand, it's absolutely true that if we are not a union of values, then we are no union at all. And it is unthinkable that we would allow countries to go back on commitments to fundamental rights, the rule of law, which are absolutely at the core of what we do. So getting that balance right is not simple. We've got a process with Poland on particularly the reform of the judiciary. We've used the European Court of Justice, which has given at least an interim ruling, which the Polish government have said they will respect. So I think in that sense, the system is sort of working. More complicated in Hungary, and the European Parliament has recently passed a resolution asking that Article 7 be triggered for Hungary, and we will have to start that discussion. Where does it come from? I think it is perhaps inevitable that with the speed of the transition for the countries of Central Europe, between 1990 and 2004, and then the enormous changes which those countries went through once they joined the European Union, that maybe there is a little backlash, there's a little nostalgia, a sense of reasserting national identity, a sense of looking for maybe more certainty, and not all the wounds of the communist era have been fully healed, in my view. That you see this in Poland, where they feel the judiciary is still a relic of the Soviet times. So I think it's a combination of factors. I think we have to be very sympathetic to the pressures and the tensions in these countries. On the other hand, I think we have to remain very firm that at the end of the day, the European Union is about fundamental values. It is about democracy. It is about the rule of law. And we have to hold countries accountable if we feel that they have moved in the wrong direction. So this is going to be a complicated debate. On the specific issue of financial sanctions, I think it needs to be part of the arsenal in terms of the ability ultimately to say to countries, well, if we feel you are clearly in breach of fundamental principles and we feel you are not responding to the request to correct that there are sanctions, including possibly financial sanctions. But I don't think it's an instrument of last resort for me. It shouldn't become the starting point. It should be maybe the end point of a process where we try through all other means to persuade countries to correct deficiencies which may be there in their system. But we have to avoid, above all else, a counter-reaction in these countries, or countries which may be concerned by this, that somehow it's bullying from Brussels and it's external pressure from people who don't understand Poland, who don't understand Hungary, and then you get a sort of a circling of the wagons in these countries against an external pressure. So it's a very delicate process which we have to manage.
So 2 days ago, Donald Trump declared the State of the Union was strong. It would seem to me harder to argue that the state of transatlantic relations is equally strong at this point. If you follow, in the last few years, whether it's in words and in deeds, be it the unfortunate decision to temporarily downgrade the status of the European Union, whether it's words calling the European Union a foe. There's certainly been enough fodder to be wary about the state of transatlantic relations. So, do you think, is there more reasons to be optimistic beyond these headlines in terms of the resilience of the transatlantic partnership? Or are we entering a difficult phase and one that is going to be difficult in a more sustained period of time?
No, I am optimistic, and I think the transatlantic relationship is extremely resilient. I recently, a few months ago, had the occasion, I was down in Texas, and I had the opportunity to meet with former President George W. Bush. We had an interesting discussion about his time in office. And as I was coming out of the building, I remember that in 2002, we were having a trade war with America over steel tariffs. President Bush had just announced that America would not ratify the Kyoto Climate Change Treaty, and the American administration had just vetoed a European attempt to engage with Iran to have a treaty to prevent them from developing nuclear weapons. Does it sound familiar? The following year, we had the Iraq War, which was probably the lowest point of transatlantic relations since the Second World War. We came back from all of that. And I believe, yes, we are going through, and we can talk about that if you wish, we are going through a period of tension and difficult relations with an administration which is openly disruptive and which was elected on a platform that America is not happy with its alliances and its relationships and its trade relationships, and they want to reset that. We don't necessarily share the analysis, but this is clearly going to create some tensions in the relationship. But I'm very optimistic that we will work our way through this, and that this relationship, which is still, much more important for either of us than our relationship with anybody else, will survive these kind of tensions and continue to be of fundamental importance for the United States and for the European Union.
So that's speaking of Iran and the Iran nuclear deal, which I think it always bears reminding that it started through negotiation with the EU3 back in 2003. So the deal was certainly long in the making, and I think was a very important diplomatic achievement for the EU and its partners. But in the recent days, the EU3 have launched these so-called special purpose vehicles. The idea was to facilitate a certain kind of trade with Iran without running afoul of American sanctions. So do you think this special purpose vehicle will be sufficient to preserve the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal? And what kind of impact is it likely to have on already thorny transatlantic relations?
Well, I mean, you know, and I think I can't remember when I was last year, but I think we also talked about this. I mean, we regret the U.S. decision to withdraw from the JCPOA. We would have wished America to continue. The European side has made very clear from the very beginning that we continue to believe this deal is vital for our security and that we intend to preserve it. We believe that whatever the other problems we have with Iran, and they are many, an Iran which is nuclear armed would make those problems 10 times worse. And as long as Iran is respecting the deal, which it is, confirmed now I think through 13 times by the International Atomic Energy Agency and recently confirmed publicly by the director of the CIA in front of the Senate, that Iran is also entitled to have the benefit of the sanctions relief, which was the quid pro quo of the deal. And all the Europeans are doing is respecting their side of a bargain to which they remain committed. And so much as we respect the right of the United States to withdraw from the deal, however much we may regret it, we, of course, ask that this administration respects the Europeans' right to remain in the deal and to continue to deliver on its outcome. The special purpose vehicle, as you say, is a new instrument designed to make it slightly easier for trade in certain products because we're mostly talking here about products which are actually not subject of sanctions or which are in fact exempted under the sanctions for humanitarian reasons, so medical goods, medical devices, pharmaceuticals, and so forth. So it's not about evading sanctions because these products are not under sanction. On the other hand, even products which are not under sanction, it's difficult to trade them because of the complexity of the financing system. Many suppliers are nervous about getting caught in the sanctions net, and therefore even when something is not sanctioned, they're reluctant to engage in. So this is designed to create a vehicle which makes it possible for people to have more security in trading in these products. So I think that is where we are. So far as we're concerned, European companies doing legitimate trade under European law with Iran is something which we will seek to preserve and protect. Will it be enough for Iran to feel they are getting benefit, even though many companies faced with a choice between trading with Iran and trading with the United States will choose the United States because it's a much bigger and wealthier market? We understand that. We're not naive. That only time will tell. I mean, the Iranians will have to make that judgment themselves, but as Europeans, we are committed to doing all we can to ensure that Iran, to the extent they maintain, that they respect and continue to implement the deal, that they will get some of the economic and commercial benefits out of that deal, which was the bargain at the core of the agreement.
So I would be remiss if I didn't talk a little bit about trade, since it's a subject close to your heart. And there's an interesting juxtaposition recently where the EU-Japan treaty has just come into force, a pretty ambitious treaty in terms of its scope and in terms of what it does. And conversely, we have in the United States and China countries that are raising barriers rather than lowering them. At the same time, of course, there's been tariff tension between the United States and the EU last year. And recently, I think there was a release of negotiating positions by both the US and the EU, and it showed that these positions are still very wide and far apart when it comes to trade access to markets on agriculture, for instance, in Europe. So how likely do you think that there is a further escalation of a tariff battle between the United States and the EU? Do you think there's sufficient willingness on both sides to address those issues, or are we heading towards more protectionism here?
Well, I mean, two parts to your question. I mean, the first part about, the Japan deal. I think it's important to observe that the European Union already has an extensive network of some 60 free trade deals with most parts of the world, extensive trade deals with our immediate neighborhood, Central Eastern Europe, Eastern Partnership countries, North Africa, the African continent. a number of countries in Latin America and in Asia. But we have an ambitious agenda, and we have just finished in the last 2 years, I think, a very comprehensive trade deal with Canada. We've just updated our first generation agreement with Mexico. We're in the process of doing the same thing with Chile, and we are in negotiations with Mercosur, the grouping of Latin American countries around Brazil, Paraguay, Uruguay. And we have concluded now with Japan, which is the largest free trade deal ever completed, representing nearly a third of global trade. When we finish our full agenda, as we hope to do this year, we've also started negotiations with Australia and New Zealand, and we're in negotiations with the Philippines and Indonesia. When we finish our full free trade agenda, the European Union will be at the center of the largest free trade network the world has ever seen. And I just think it's very important to remind you of that, because people sometimes, think, oh, the Europeans, trade isn't very popular. We have tensions in our society about trade, same as anywhere, about who wins and who loses and globalization. But the fact is, fundamentally, trade is in the European DNA. We know that trade makes you wealthier. And then you have issues about how you redistribute that wealth, or how you deal with some of the downside consequences of trade, and there are downside consequences of trade. But we believe it's better to manage those in a different way than closing your border, and to keep your borders open. And so I just want to remind people of just what a free trading power the European Union is today and will be in the future. With the US, look. The transatlantic economic relationship is the single most important economic relationship in the world, bar none. I mean, we are each other's biggest and most important partners by whatever way you want to measure it. That's trade in goods, trade in services, investment, and it's also a very balanced relationship because we are respectively the first and second largest economies in the world. I mean, the three largest economies in the world by far are China, EU, and the US. Today, and we are, massive traders and investors between us. But, the administration does not feel very comfortable with the arrangements. They would like a sort of make some adjustments. We've had the dispute over steel and aluminium tariffs. We did not agree with the use of the national security argument to impose tariffs on European steel and aluminium. We really don't understand in what way this poses a threat to United States security. But okay, when President Juncker came here in July of last year, he sat down with President Trump, and they agreed a common agenda on how to address some of these concerns. Four main pillars. First of all, a potential free trade agreement in the area of industrial products. Secondly, continuing work on regulatory issues. Thirdly, specific work on LNG, because we would like more American exports of LNG, at the moment subject to licensing provisions, which we would like to see eliminated. Soybeans, which is where the potential for increased exports has been huge, and there has been a massive increase in U.S. Soybean exports. And we've just recently agreed that U.S. soybeans can be certified to participate in our biofuel program, so that they can be used to help create biofuel. And finally, work on the WTO. This is the agenda we have in front of us. We've had several meetings, and there are experts working on this constantly. On the negotiating objectives, yes, it's true that the USTR, because Congress requires this under the Trade Promotion Authority, has put forward negotiating directives. If you look, the negotiating directives are pretty similar for everyone they're proposing to negotiate with. So Japan, the EU, UK, they're all very similar because they're following a template from the agreement formerly known as NAFTA, the USMCA, and that's their wish list. Fine, that's good. I mean, if they want, that's what they want to negotiate, they put it on the table. What we have agreed, however, and what President Trump and President Juncker agreed in the Oval Office in July, was to negotiate on industrial tariffs and not on agricultural tariffs. Now, why was that? I will tell you that the agreement that was reached because on the American side, people were very keen that we would not enter into a lengthy negotiation over many years. People wanted quick results. President Juncker said, well, actually the thing we could do most quickly and most simply is industrial tariffs. That is relatively uncomplicated for both of us. Some sensitivities on either side, we can manage that. We could do that in a matter of a year or so. If we want to negotiate on things like agriculture, from the European side, we're also going to say we'd like to talk about government procurement. The American government procurement market is mainly closed with the Buy America policy, or issues like geographical indications, which are quite controversial here, and we risk to have a negotiation that goes for a long time. So that's where we are, and we will see, going forward. We understand there's a lot of pressure in Congress to say, oh, you must include agriculture. We were talking about Brexit. Decisions have consequences, so we have to make some choices. We can do something on industrial tariffs very quickly and deliver a success in a reasonable time frame, or we can set ourselves a much more complicated agenda and accept that we will go into then a lengthy negotiation over several years, and it'll be probably for the next administration to decide if they like the outcome of that negotiation. So we will, we think what we agreed in July is the best way forward. Of course, if the United States doesn't, no longer thinks that, or now thinks differently about it, we'll have to see.
So I'd like to give you a warning that I'm going to ask one more question, and afterwards I'm going to open it up to the audience. So if you are interested in asking questions, I would ask you to sort of slowly make your way towards a microphone so that we can have a relatively seamless transition. So as a final question on my part, elections in Europe in recent years have become constantly referendums on the strength of populism. And that's the way they're often covered. So one of the main elections this year will be the European Parliament elections in May. And certainly certain political figures, such as the French President Macron or Italian leader Matteo Salvini, have also been very keen to turn this election into an opposition between those who support integration and those who support more populist agendas. Is this a beneficial way to frame this election? I mean, I suppose it could increase turnout and interest, but is that a right way to frame this election in your view?
Well, it's not for me to tell President Macron or others, how they want to. They're the politicians. They're going to run the election campaign. They will decide how they want to present it. I do think. I mean, your opening comment that elections have been sort of cast as a sort of referendum on populism. I think it's actually not very accurate if you look across the whole of Europe. People, talked. Some of the Anglo-Saxon coverage of continental elections, in my view, is rather misplaced. The elections in Sweden, people made sound as though the Sweden Democrats were, the biggest threat to democracy. They end up with 18% of the votes. Alternative for Deutschland got 13% of the votes. I mean, let's keep this in perspective. Now, I agree, the French election was slightly more complicated, where it was a runoff system between Mrs. Le Pen and President Macron, but even there, a very clear victory for a centrist position. So I think there is an issue of populism, don't get me wrong, and I suspect, again, all the projections are that the sort of populist, anti-establishment forces in various parts of Europe will see a boost in the European Parliament, and so people put the number at maybe as high as 25-30%. It's still not anything like a majority, and bear in mind that very few of these parties have anything in common with each other. In fact, they are frequently diametrically opposed to each other, and the nationalism or populism in one country is actually opposed to the nationalism and populism in another country. So they do not represent a cohesive force in European political terms. We have to deal with this. This is democracy. If people want to vote for these parties, we have to understand why are they voting for such anti-establishment parties. And it will certainly, I think probably make for an interesting European Parliament, but this is democracy, and I'd much rather that this debate takes place inside a parliament on the basis of democratically legitimate elections, and then we have a discussion about what this means, who actually has the best policies. Because I think over time, the question is still going to be, do these populist parties have policies which actually deliver for people? And personally, but it's a personal view, I don't think they do, but let us see and let that be tested. And are these policies capable of delivering better outcomes than those advocated by the mainstream parties? I'm fairly confident, quoting W.B. Yeats, that in the end the center will hold. But yes, these are forces not just in Europe, not just in the United States, not just in Latin America. It's something of a global phenomenon that there is a sort of resurgence of these kind of policies. We have to respect the electorate and continue the debate on the substance of the issues.
So I just want to invite you to make sure you introduce yourself, not only for the ambassador, but also for the crowd watching on the live stream.
Good afternoon, Ambassador. My name is Jake Ferris. I'm a grad student here in the School of International Service. I wanted to ask about the Western Balkans and EU expansion policy toward the Western Balkans, specifically concerning your background in trade and economics. I wanted to ask about how you see a way forward for the Western Balkans, be it a group bloc enlargement like we've seen in the EU in the past, or more one-on-one, specifically because economic security and economic policy in the Balkans is vastly divergent country to country, and how you see the EU moving forward to enlarge within the Western Balkans. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, we are very clear. We have given a full commitment to the Western Balkans that they have a European perspective. So they are going to join the European Union. The only debate is the precise timing and mechanics of that. Each negotiation is with a sovereign country. So, you cannot condition one to another, except, I would say, for example, in the case of Serbia and Kosovo, it is clear that neither will be able to join the European Union if we haven't resolved the sort of border, the recognition dispute between them, because nobody wants to import an unresolved problem between two countries. And everyone accepts that the Western Balkans, that the only way that we will actually facilitate peace and stability in that region is when they are all part of the European Union, which will solve a lot of other problems. So I don't think anyone has yet taken a decision as to whether this is one country at a time, a group of countries at a time. I think each country has to work its way through the accession process. Some are already at the sort of negotiation stage, some are not quite there yet. The only thing I would say is that I don't think anyone is going to be locked into an artificial time frame. This will take the time it takes. We can go as quickly as these countries are able to adopt the standards and the requirements of accession, and of course resolving some of the tensions which remain that are well known. So I think we are very committed, and on this I must say there's full transatlantic unity. We have strong US and EU common view of this, that we need to help the Western Balkans resolve their outstanding political problems, focus on providing a better quality of life for their citizens through economic reform, and that will be greatly facilitated by the accession process, as it was for the countries in 2004. And I think this is a very firm commitment. But on the other hand, it shouldn't be considered, it's not a blank check. It's not an automatic entitlement to join on whatever terms the countries want. They have to respect the criteria and the process. And as I say, I don't think anyone is saying it's one at a time, or it's a group, or it's all of them. We will wait and see how the individual accession negotiations go, and if some countries are ready and there's no obstacle to them joining, I imagine they can join, as for example, Croatia did. On the other hand, there may be reasons why it's necessary to group a few together, because there are still some unresolved regional issues which would unlock the process for more than one country.
Good afternoon, Ambassador. I'm an Austrian Fulbright student here at SIS. My name is Julia Parecki. I wanted to ask about the European nation brand, and given your experience here and your time here during the last years, and considering the diverse cultural and linguistic field in Europe, do you believe that the EU has such a thing as a nation brand here in the US, how it is perceived? Thank you.
I mean, the EU isn't a nation. So I'm not trying to be smart, but I mean, does the EU have its own sort of image? I think so, but I will admit that the European Union is probably the single most important international grouping of which the United States is not a part. And this gives the United States a very different perspective on the EU, and it makes it difficult, willingly, or I admit, at times for people in America to understand exactly what the EU is. Is it an economic bloc? Is it a sort of defense arrangement, which of course it isn't? So I would willingly accept that one of the things I've had to do, and my successor, and my predecessor had to do, is constantly to try to explain what this is and what it isn't. It's also difficult because America thinks very much in terms of nation, the American nation, and people even use the term, by the way, loosely to refer to the European nations. Now, as those of us who are European know, European nation is not coterminous with European states. And that's already a very important thing to understand about Europe. And when you throw the word nation around loosely in Europe, we know where that's led us in the past and we know where it could lead us in the future. So what we are doing is something completely unique, which is building out of 28, maybe 27 after the 29th of March, sovereign states, an international legal order and supranational institutions. It's never been done before. And yet we are doing this, and out of this we have created the single market, we've created the common currency, we've created a common foreign and security policy, but we are doing this in a way which says we are not trying to eliminate the nation, the member states. We are not trying to obliterate our national differences of language, of culture, and it is, you say, a pluribus unum here. From many one in Europe, our motto is united in diversity. So we are not trying to say that Austria should not have its national brand marketed here in the United States. Austria as a tourist destination, as a commercial destination, as a country with values and opinions about world affairs, which are different maybe from some of their neighbors. But what we're trying to do is focus on what we have in common and how, by working together, we can firstly contain some of the tensions that we know historically can arise between the countries of Europe, and at the same time deliver better outcomes for our citizens. Just take the example of trade. I don't think any of our countries believe that they would be better off negotiating with Japan as one country, rather than as a single market of 500 million people, which has real leverage and real weight and heft in trade negotiations. That's one illustration, but there are many, many others. So you're right. I mean, I think the reason why we don't have a nation brand is because we're not a nation. And you know, we have to explain what we are. But what we are is hugely important. And it's also hugely important for this country, because people shouldn't want to push us either to be a European nation, which in my view is an absurdity, or to go back to being individual nations, which is equally not a good thing for Europe. And America needs to understand that the uniqueness of the European Union and its construct of bringing together sovereign states with a high degree of supranational integration in certain areas is something from which the United States benefits hugely, economically and in terms of security, but also in terms of foreign policy. Look at the Venezuela, how much, we weren't actually able to agree finally a fully common position, but the fact that all the countries of Europe weighed in more or less in the same direction as the United States. This is something of value, and when we work together, we represent a considerable body of international opinion, which can be a force for good in the world.
We're going to take two questions. Yes, if you can ask a question, then I'm going to add a very short one because I know that time is limited. So please. Go ahead.
Good afternoon, Ambassador. My name is Zainabu. I am from Niger. I'm a grad student here. Basically, my question, you talked about currency, the euro being a currency that unifies Europe, basically certain countries in Europe. I just want to know, what is your intake when it comes to the franc CFA in Africa and the late controversy that is going on with France and Italy that currency basically is some sort of a control, a mean of control for France towards African countries.
And if I can ask, Ambassador, since, as was mentioned earlier, you are about to retire after a long and distinguished career, if you had some words of reflection and advice for the many students here who may be contemplating as well a career in public service, and since our school is named after that word as well, I think it would be a befitting conclusion, if you didn't mind.
Yeah, I mean, in answer to your question, look, you can have that debate. I don't think that is the reason why these countries have that currency. For many, I mean, it's quite natural when you have a sort of colonial heritage. It's not unusual for countries to retain a link. I mean, for many years after independence, Ireland basically had a single currency with the UK, because that's the way we had operated before, and it didn't seem to make a lot of sense to change it. Then we broke with the pound sterling in 1979 when we joined the European monetary system, and since then we've gone on to adopt the euro, which the UK has not. So, I think the debate about whether you need your own currency or a currency which is linked maybe to a partner with whom you trade a great deal is a choice to be made on purely economic calculus as to what's in your best interest at any given moment. And as I say, the virtues of having an independent currency, it can have positives, it can also have negatives. And I'm not myself a fetishist about, the currency as a symbol of nationality. It's a tool. And you look at it as what is the best tool for your country. Do you want to have your own currency? Do you want to sort of link yourself to someone else's currency with whom you trade a great deal and with whom you have close ties? Or do you want to be part of a common currency? These are the options, and I think countries make their own choices. Garret, to your question, look, I mean, I have had the luckiest career imaginable, and the one thing I would say to you is, I would say, firstly, I mean, I've had a great career of public service, and I've been privileged to participate in 40 years of European integration, which has just been unimaginable. I joined the European Commission in 1979. We were 9 countries. My first job was relations with Comecon. Now, probably nobody in this room remember. Well, one or two people nod their heads. Thank you. Which was basically the Soviet answer to the European Economic Community. It was a sort of economic bloc around the Warsaw Pact. If you said to me in 1979, in 2019, you will be sitting at the American University in Washington as the European Union ambassador in Washington, representing a European Union of 28 countries, of whom 13 were formerly in members of Comecon, the largest trading bloc in the world with a single currency, representing 19 countries, and a unified common foreign and security policy, and that you, as the EU ambassador, speak on behalf of those 28 member states in Washington, I would have said you are dreaming. And yet that's what we've done. And that's been a huge privilege. So I think public service is remarkably rewarding. Of course, there are different models. I mean, in Europe, we tend to have a model of permanent public service. In other words, I've worked in the public service for 40 years. I'm retiring at the end of next month, and I'm going to discover what it's like outside the public service. And there are other models here in the United States. You do much more of the revolving door. People work in the private sector, and then people come in. There are advantages and disadvantages in both systems. I'm not going to get into that now. But I do believe that the quality of a country's public service is vital for its democracy and for the health of its good governance. I think an independent, well-trained, reasonably well-paid civil service is as important a part of democracy as the elections and the free press, because it's what provides the stability and the consistency and the continuity in a system where you have the alternance of government and of politics. And ultimately, of course, that's civil service. And I have never thought that I was anything other than under the authority of politicians. I have never felt that it's I who make policy or that it's I who make the decisions. I give advice and I implement. If I have a real disagreement of policy, then I can register that or I can resign. But it's not the civil service that make the policy. On the other hand, a professional civil service is absolutely indispensable in a system where you have regular alternance of political power, because it is that you have the expertise, the continuity, and the commitment to the best interests of the country that is hugely important. So it's a great privilege. You won't get rich in the public service, so. If you're thinking, that you want to make money, and I'm not joking, it's a choice in life. It's also, my final point, it's frustrating because it is bureaucratic. It is necessarily less dynamic than the private sector, and less, you have less autonomy, you have less kind of freedom of movement because you're part of a system, and necessarily the checks and balances of that require that you limit the margin of maneuver of individual civil servants, because you don't want them making up policy or going rogue. So there's a price to be paid for being a participant in that public service. But on the other hand, the rewards are huge when you look back at this with satisfaction at what you've been able to achieve for your country, or in my case for the European Union as a whole.
Well, it has been a great privilege of having you today, and we're really appreciative of the time as a fellow Irishman as well, as there's always extra source of pride there. But I hope you can all join me in thanking the ambassador and wishing him luck in his next step in his life and career. Thank you. Thank you.